Okay. Right, we will start. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to our guests online as well. It's lovely to see you all, and I think this is going to be a very enjoyable event. Just to remind people of the housekeeping, so the event is being recorded, and our online guests are very welcome to put questions into the Q&A box on your screens. And just to say to those participating online that you can change the view if you wish to see the speaker bigger or the slides bigger. That's a feature that you should have on your own computer. I don't think we can manipulate that for you, but that's something that's been confusing people in previous broadcasts. So I'm really delighted to welcome you tonight to a talk by a speaker who is very well known here at the British School at Rome. Ronald Ridley, Ron, who was educated at the universities of Sydney, where he did his master's, and Melbourne, where he completed his doctorate. And he also holds an honorary degree from Macquarie University. And all three of those institutions are ones that also institutionally have deep relationships with us here at the BSR. Ron's had a very long and distinguished academic career. He retired from a personal chair at the University of Melbourne after 41 years of teaching there. In Italy, his work has been widely recognized. He is a winner of the prestigious Premio Daria Borghese, which is a prize that's awarded annually for the best book about Rome written by a non-Italian. And he won the prize in 2019 for his book, The Prince of Antiquarians, Francesco de Ficoroni. And in 2022, Ron was also awarded honorary Italian citizenship for his contribution to the history of Rome. He is an academic with interest particularly in the history of the ancient world, with a focus on Egypt and Rome, the history of archaeology, and the history of historiography, which sounds like something that will break your brain, incredibly difficult. And he has a special focus on Egypt and Rome, and he's written and published widely in these areas. I was going to count up the publications, but I had to abandon that task because it was too much. Together with his wife, Therese, Ron has also had a very long and deep relationship with the British School at Rome. In fact, he just told me in conversation before I began that it goes back 53 years to 1971. Ron and Therese are long-standing supporters of our academic mission here in Rome, and they are also very generous sponsors of an award for a young scholar who comes to the BSR every year from the University of Melbourne to carry out their own research. And we'll be welcoming this year's Therese and Ronald Ridley scholar, Ronak Alberts, to the BSR in February, and we are so grateful for their really fundamental support. This is not the first lecture that Ron has given at the BSR. We're really delighted to be welcoming him back tonight to talk on a very intriguing topic, the Great Livy Delusion of 1924. So please join me in welcoming Ronald Ridley.
Thank you very much for that more than generous introduction. I feel it is indeed a very great honor to be allowed to offer a public lecture here at this revered institution. I also want to mention that there's a very special guest here tonight, Professoressa Zinetta Mazzarino, who is the elder daughter of Santo Mazzarino, the greatest Roman historian I ever knew, and I've known a few. I also have to thank my old colleague, my old student and now colleague and friend, Dr. Claudia Sagona, without whom we wouldn't have a slideshow. I'm totally incompetent with IT, and I always take my illustrations to her, and she photoshops and carries on, and we have this lovely show. Now, I want to alert you to the fact that there are lots of connections with British scholars and the BSR even in what I'm about to tell you. Let's see if I can have the first slide. Yes. What we have here is a copy of an announcement in a little-known Neapolitan journal, the Revista Indico Greco Italica, of the 5th of August, 1924, a journal, little known, I think even in Naples, edited by a man who was to become quite famous later on, Francesco Ribezzo. And this announcement, Sensazionale Scoperta, appeared on the bottom of the back paper cover of the issue of that date, the 5th of August, 1924. Now, I want to draw your attention to just a couple of things. It's all about, the finding by, you can see Dr. Mario di Martino-Fusco there, who also has his own journal, you notice, Museon. We have this journal in the library, the Ribezzo journal. We don't have Martino-Fusco's journal. And I'm sorry to say that if you go to this library and look up Ribezzo's journal, you can't find the back cover of this issue. When the volumes were bound, someone ripped off the back cover and threw it away, despite the title. So I owe this slide to a dear friend, a librarian in the Vatican Library. Their copy still has the announcement. So what I want to emphasize to you is that he mentions that we communicate, the second last line, we communicate the notice of this discovery, so great, sulla fede di Dottore Di Martino, relying upon the word of him. And that he mentions that he had, well, I can't find that there, but somewhere in the text, he mentions having questioned Di Martino at various times. My question is, what did Ribezzo think he was doing? He's announcing the discovery of what is presumably not only the lost, more than 100 books, because we've got 35 out of the 142. He's announcing the discovery of the whole set of Livy's lost books to the world, outing, so to speak, as I think we would now say, outing Martino-Fusco, taking it upon himself to say he's been questioning him for a long time and he can't get any thing out of him except that he says he's found the lost books. And he doesn't have any evidence, and so he's saying it's on the fade in the last line there. He's relying upon the good word, the trustworthiness of Di Martino. I think there's borders on the criminal. I'm really horrified at what Ribezzo did here. He went on to be a very well-known comparative linguist, and when he died in the 50s, as I remember, there was a very glowing obituary in Studi Etruschi. Needless to say, as with every other player in this whole story, needless to say, not a breath about 1924, the events of 1924. Everyone who plays a leading role has concealed their mostly ignominious contributions. Well, that's the 5th of August, 1924. Nothing happens, which shows how well known this journal is. And then English scholarship takes over. On the 21st of August, 2 weeks later, both the Times and the Times Literary Supplement publish both this original Italian and a translation. And that is by courtesy of the keeper of Greek and Roman antiquities in the British Museum, Arthur Hamilton Smith. Arthur, where are you? Oh, I'm pressing the wrong button. Arthur Hamilton Smith, who was, this is 1924, 4 years later, to become director of the British School. He held office only for 2 years, 1928 to 1930, and then again briefly in 1932. This is all the tumultuous time after the resignation of Thomas Ashby, of course. But it wasn't a very happy time, as I understand, for this brilliant scholar, because he'd spent all his life in the special atmosphere of the British Museum, and I think the rough and tumble of the British school, scholars and artists and so on, was a little bit too much for him. But there he's the man who brings to the attention of the world this announcement. Well, then the world knew about it. Then everyone knew about it. And Martino, I'll call him that because many Italian sources call him simply Martino. The name Martino-Fusco is a combination of his mother's and father's surname. simply scampered. He decamped from Naples. Every newspaper in the world sent some special correspondent to interview him and find him. So he simply went, and where he went was to a villa in Capri, which apparently the family owned. So we begin to learn something about Martino. In fact, this whole operation, which I've been thinking about for years and years, and I started gathering the material, I can't remember how long ago, in the Biblioteca Nazionale, when you could still get decent photocopies off the microfilms, which you could simply print out. You can't do that anymore. And I mentioned it to my dear friend Leandro Polverini, great historiographer, and he waved a languid hand at me and said, "Oh, but we all know all about that." Don't think, Leandro unfortunately is no longer with us. I don't think he was right. I don't think we know all about this. So it's a history that depends essentially on newspapers, and I can only tell you as an historian, that's a nightmare. I remember all my colleagues back home who are national historians who thought it was just wonderful, you know, everything they wanted to know about, they just looked up the contemporary newspapers and there it all was. What they seemed not to understand was that you're relying upon journalists who have to get a story, and every journalist wants to have a scoop, as they call it. And then you're relying upon the newspaper and its sub-editors who will do anything to make copy to sell a paper. So working with newspapers, I don't recommend it. It's one of the most horrific projects I've ever undertaken. But, and in Naples, just to show you a little bit about that background, there were two papers, of course there must have been many more, but two principal papers, Il Mattino, which supported the discovery through thick and thin, and Il Mezzogiorno, which was from the beginning and throughout the whole thing skeptical. So, of course, they realized that was the way to sell papers, to take opposite sides in the whole debate. In fact, the best journalist of all reporting in Italy was working for the Corriere della Sera, still a very respectable paper. Filippo Sacchi was his name. He was a film critic, and I think his skills as a film critic stood him in good stead with the melodramas that were to ensue. But he also was a very educated man, and what he thought his readers would understand still surprises me when I read his copy. So Martino decamps, and the journalists descend upon his house in the Via del Duomo, number 290, where his mother is still in situ, and besiege her, and there's a sister also. In fact, the only declaration we have from Martino himself is this letter that he wrote on the 4th of September. He sent a letter to all the newspapers. "I request you publish these declarations of mine. The enormous publicity that has been given to the notice of the publication of the codices containing the decades, not decades, nothing to do with 10 years, decades, of Titus Livius, and the growing interest of scholars, forced me to abandon the reserve which I imposed upon myself." It's funny, you know, you're connected with a sensational discovery and you're talking about your reserve. It doesn't quite add up. "I request that I be left in the industrious peace for my studies, and not be distracted by a persecution which takes away the calm for the completion of the work to which I am dedicated, and that one await with confidence the account which I will be able to make following my studies. For the moment, I believe the best advice is to follow the words of Professor Cocchia, one of his teachers in Naples. That is, that it is necessary to advance cautiously, festina lente, and that until everything has been well evaluated, well studied, well clarified, it's not possible to communicate elements which in their consequences could assume a value and meaning different from that which a hasty account might suggest. I declare, therefore, that I will not depart from the line of conduct recommended by my seriousness as a student, that is, not to reply to any questions until I'm able to speak with that rigorous precision required by the importance of my work." And that's the only statement we have from Martino himself in the whole procedure. I'll give you a taste of Filippo Sacchi's commentary. In the Corriere della Sera on the 7th of September, he describes some of the journalistic frenzy in Naples. The scenes in Naples were straight from the screen. I told you he was a film critic. He says that this house of Martino, has seen for a week memorable things: assaults, incursions, journalists arriving cross-dressed, the better to be able to get what they want by force, furious quarrels with the doorkeeper, pursuits up the stairs, everything imaginable. And he mentioned that there was an English journalist who came non-stop, 45 hours, he says it took him. I can't imagine from London how it takes you 45 hours. It came non-stop from London, 45 hours, rushed straight to the Via del Duomo, thinking he could speak immediately with Martino, only to be confronted by the portiere speaking in Neapolitan dialect. And then things really became serious. There were pezzi di novanta, as we say, really eminent people, ettore paes, since just recently, in the last year or two, before this, had been appointed as professor of Roman history at the Sapienza, chucking Giulio Belloc out of his chair of ancient history and restricting him to Greek history on the grounds that only an Italian should be able to teach Italian history, ancient history at that. He, on the 8th of September, called for a national edition of the text of Livy, which of course no one had ever seen. Given the high interest, he said, of the nation, the expectations of the whole civil world, was it not appropriate to determine the authenticity of the discovery of the codices? He further asked, he's questioning in the Senate, he was a senator, questioning the Minister of Education. He further asked if, given the technical and financial difficulties, which would greatly impede the rapid publication by the discoverer, was there not a case for removing the codices from Martino and instead providing a national edition at state expense and more quickly to bring honour on scholarship and the good name of Italy? To which Carlo Pascal, the professor of Latin in Pavia, replied that he calculated Paeus' edition under these conditions would not appear in under 30 years, and he had a very, very sensible alternative. His counter-proposal was to make 100 photographic copies of all the text and distribute them to public libraries all around the world so that as many scholars as possible could get to work and start deciphering them. Well, after this call by Paeus for a national edition, finally, the government began to intervene, realizing that if what was being said was true, very important matters were all in contention. The Minister of Education, Alessandro Casati, summoned Martino, ordered him to present himself to give a full account of what he'd done, what he'd discovered, and so on. This is on the 10th of September. Martino failed to appear twice. He didn't appear on the 11th, he didn't appear on the 12th, and in the meantime, just to show how dirty the whole story could become, there was a purported interview with Martino by a German classical scholar who revelled in the name of Max Funke, which literally means spark, so I think you could call him a bright spark. A Leipzig classic, except you can't find any trace of him in any classical connection. He manages to get to Capri, unlike everyone else. Well, everyone else got to Capri, but never managed to find Martino. Managed to interview him. And this interview was published on the 12th of September in the Leipziger Tageblatt. Martino had told Funke there was no doubt about the genuineness of his discovery. And he showed Funke, now there are still questions I can't answer, and here's one of them. He showed Funke a volume containing an account of the foundation of Carthage, which would be, if you look up the epitomes of Livy, book 16. The only references we have to Martino working at this time are, in fact, on the second decade, books 11 to 20. The foundation of Carthage, he's working on that. He said he had transcribed it and was about to translate it. Which, if you think about it, is a very strange way to talk about what he's doing. You don't exactly transcribe the codex, and you certainly wouldn't be thinking of translating it. He said to Funke that, so Funke claimed, Martino said, the date of the codex he had was about the 6th century. He claimed that he had found the missing books as long ago as the last year, 1923. in an ancient monastery under Castel dell'Ovo, the egg-shaped castle in Naples, now a Neapolitan military prison. And he got in there because he was invited by a colonel of the 3rd Italian Infantry Regiment to examine some ancient frescoes. And then he went on, according to Funke, to assert his this is unbelievable, to assert his private ownership of the lost books. And he started to fantasize about vast fortunes to be made, selling, number one, the rights to publish the text. He thought he could get 1 million gold marks in Germany, and then selling the original codices in either England or America for about £1 million. But remember, this is the interview which Funke claims he's had with him. It's not Martino speaking, it's Funke. The whole interview was a fraud. The whole interview was a fraud. The statements that Funke attributed to Martino were libelous. And the amazing thing, and here is the crux of the story, the amazing thing is that Martino supposedly allowed Funke to copy 4 lines out of the codices. 4 lines out of a missing 100+ books, which was then published by the Leipzig Tageblatt. What, in fact, Funke published was a facsimile taken from an article back in the Mezzogiorno in Naples, simply an example of uncial script. Then finally, Martino did appear on the 16th of September, and the man appointed to, there's the 4 lines, there's the 4 lines. Ubi multitudo hominum inspirata occurrit audire gallum de San Martino virtutibus locutorum. It's even so badly copied you can barely make sense of it. Just remember those 4 lines, some 12 words. The man appointed to conduct the inquiry, wait a minute, I've jumped the slides somehow. Yes, the man appointed to conduct the inquiry, let's go on and see his picture, is Fausto Nicolini, a very famous Neapolitan scholar who was Inspector General of the State Archives, and he conducted the inquiry. And under quizzing, Martino collapsed. He started to just speak gibberish. He was so overcome, because what he was forced to admit was that there was an absolutely well-known note about King Robert of Naples, who ruled from 1309 to 1343, paying a scribe to copy out Livy's Macedonian War, which means, of course, essentially books 31 to 40, which we've had since the time of Petrarch. And this is the explanation of what was going on with de Martino, which he'd been playing about with for more than a year, obviously. Seeing that Robert paid a scribe to copy out the 4th decade, books 31 to 40, it's a possible assumption, certainly the one that Martino jumped at, that maybe Robert had a copy of the whole of the books of Livy. That was Martino's assumption. And if he just kept looking, searching everywhere in Naples, all the dark corners, he might finally come across it. But all, in fact, the text he was going on said was that Robert got a copy of the 4th decade, those 10 books. And when, of course, Fausto Nicolini understood what the whole thing meant and what had happened to poor Martino, and so made a report on the 18th. That was on the 16th of September. 2 days later, he made his report to the Ministry of Education and said, in some of his researches in the State Archives in Naples, de Martino came upon a document dated the 23rd of December, 1332, already published in endless quarters, every scholar of the time knew of it, in which King Robert of Anjou ordered the payment of a certain sum to a scribe named Paulinus to copy 10 books of Livy on the Macedonian War. Apparently not expert in medieval documents, De Martino believed the copy of Paulinus, rather than limited only to the 10 well-known books on the Macedonian War, referred instead to the whole text of Livy. There you have the whole story unveiled. That was the turning point. Then, on the 20th of September, another puzzle was solved. The 12 words we've seen were republished, in fact. Yes, were republished. That's the republication. Were republished in the Illustrated London News. And then English scholars pounced. A. Housman wrote to the Times on the very same day, the 20th of September. He declared, "The Provost of Eton may know where the words come from. I do not. This is not, as I first suspected, the Housman jibe." He was talking about one of his closest friends, Montague Rhodes James, who was the Provost of Eton, but also a one of the leading experts on manuscripts in England. "The Provost of Eton may know where the words come from. I do not. But clearly they are an abridgment of what Sulpicius Severus, a Christian historian of the 4th century, relates in his dialogues about St. Martin. St. Martin of Tours is the man we saw in the script, St. Martin of Tours." Housman did make a dig. He couldn't help himself. He did not omit to note that German scholars had this material from the Leipziger Tageblatt available for already a week, and not a peep out of them. No one had spotted anything. The moment Housman saw the text, he knew what it was. So, a very sad story, really, a story of delusion. I'm using the word in the title in both the English sense and the Italian sense, a disappointment. And it involved a lot of reputations which were won and lost. The first one is Solomon Reinach. This is in France, of course. The great Académie des Inscriptions Belles-Lettres, the Academy of Inscriptions and Literature, called upon Solomon Reinach, of all people, he was director of the Museum of National Antiquities, to be their expert guide in the whole sorry story. Now, Reinach was an expert on the history of Roman religion, and I think that becomes clear in his comments. He began with a very strange claim that he couldn't find Martino's name in any standard reference work, which simply means he hadn't even looked at any philologique, where Martino's name appears consistently throughout the 20s. He never stopped publishing 5-page articles. Then he said he was almost skeptical about the find because it would be an enormous number of volumes. Claims have been made about the discoveries of Livy's lost books since the 13th century, but he wouldn't rule out the story completely. There was too much smoke not to be fire. Or perhaps some fragments had been discovered. Remember in the Vatican they found some fragments of Livy in 1772. By the 5th of September, he's talking there on the 29th of August. By the 5th of September, a week later, all had changed. Martino was now fully accredited. Reinach stated that he had found either the whole text of Livy or at least some fragments. He asserted that he must have copied out the whole of the 2nd decade. Whoever told him that? Where did Solomon Reinach get that information from? He's made it up, of course. And he mentioned further that Martino had not only discovered the complete books of Livy, he'd also discovered some further Greek manuscripts, one on the fall of Troy, a life of St. Januarius, the patron saint of Naples, and also something of Tacitus. Now, you note the way in which Reinach is always having, as we say in Australia, 5 bob each way. Yes, he's found everything or he's found nothing. I think The only conclusion we can draw is that Reinach is totally out of his depth. He's talking about something about which he knows nothing. But if we want real tragedy, does anyone recognize who that is, by the way? I don't expect anyone, but it's Robert Seymour Conway, Fellow of the British Academy, Professor of Latin Literature at Manchester from 1903 to 1929, who addressed to the Times on the 10th of September an impassioned eulogy of Martino, a man of the highest integrity, whom he'd never met. He said, how could he be forging 107 lost books? It would require an army of super lunatics to begin such a task. The possibility, on the other hand, that such, quote, a high-minded, eager and conscientious young scholar might have made a mistake is only a little less insane. Conway returned to battle positions in the Times on the 15th of September. Following the publication of what we saw, the 4 lines, purported to be 4 lines of somewhere in Livy, and students of Livy's manuscripts, he said, will be strongly inclined to believe in the genuineness of the 5 words, the first 2 lines. And he went on, this is Conway, why would they believe these were, in fact, words of Livy? Because the number, Conway, by the way, was one of the editors of the Oxford Classical Text of Livy, along with Flamsteed Walters. Because the number of letters suited the averages in uncial manuscripts of Livy. Chuffed by that reassurance, he then proceeded to dig himself in irrecoverably by a more detailed linguistic analysis, asserting that the first 5 words, about the multitudo running to here, were in every way characteristically Livian. One's overall reaction is sheer incredulity. How could the genuineness of 107 lost books be judged on the basis of 5 words? And you notice that Conway is interested only in the first 5 words, because if he'd gone further, he might have asked himself, how could Livy be talking about St. Martin of Tours? And Conway appealed to any reader to send him a copy of the Leipzig Tageblatt, so he hadn't even seen the original publication. As for Martino's supposed talk of immense profits, which he'd mentioned in the supposed interview with Funke, Conway said that Funke had misunderstood Italian humour. In fact, it was the German who was playing games. And throughout all this stuff, Conway alludes to his own super intuitive understanding of Italians. Although he's an Englishman from Manchester, he's always saying that he understands the way Italians think and act, and he's got a kind of private insight into what's going on with things. Well, you can see what a fool he made of himself. And of course, when all was revealed, he made no admission of his earlier views. He made the last contribution in the Times. So much for Conway. Now, I think the most revealing comment on this whole episode was made by the great Italian Marxist Antonio Gramsci. Once again, a connection with the British school. The Via Gramsci is just at the front door. In his letters from prison in 1930, he says, in my view, the roots of the scandal are to be found in the intrigues of Professor Francesco Rebezzo, and the weakness, so he's writing 6 years after the events, and the weakness of the said professor, whose name I don't recall, that's Martino. This professor used to publish a journal, Museum, and Professor Rebezzo used to publish a rival journal. Both were useless or almost useless. I was familiar with Rebezzo's journal for many years, and I've known Rebezzo for what he's worth. The 2 of them were competing for a professorship in the University of Naples. That figures. It was Rebezzo who published in his journal the announcement of his colleague's discovery. As a result, the professor, Martino, found himself at the centre of the newspapers and public's curiosity, and he was professionally and morally wiped out. Well, that's not quite true, because as I'll point out to you in a minute when we complete the discussion by asking who Martino was, you'll see that his career was not instantly destroyed. Rebezzo had no scholarly skills. When I knew him in 1910, he'd forgotten Greek and Latin almost completely and was a specialist in Aryo-European comparative linguistics. Rebezzo's ignorance stood out so obviously, he often clashed violently with his students. At the high school in Palermo, where he was teaching, he was implicated in a scandal surrounding the murder of a professor by a student. That was in 1908 or 9. As a punishment, he was sent to Cagliari. Sorry for people from Cagliari. As a punishment, he was sent to Cagliari, where he came into conflict with the students, conflict that turned bitter in 1912 with polemics in the newspapers, death threats, etc., and he was compelled to move to Naples. He must have been strongly supported by the Neapolitan University cabal. He applied for the professorship in linguistics at the University of Torino, and when Matteo Bartoli was appointed, he made a ridiculous public display. So there's some background on these people, especially Rebezzo, from someone who knew him quite well and a contemporary. So who was Mario di Martino-Fusco? There are mysteries, and I'm once again admitting them, but not quite as many as Solomon Reinach had claimed about him. And I ran into instantly a problem that will flabbergast all of you as it flabbergasts me. People in English-speaking countries, you in the British Isles and people in the United States and we in Australia, have enormous resources at our fingertips if we are wanting to follow up biographical information. It's called BDM, of course, you probably all know about it, birth, deaths, and marriages records. I have been trying to track down a birth record or a death record for Di Martino-Fusco in Naples and simply can't get anywhere. I've consulted intelligent Italian friends, professional people who presumably have to do this kind of work, and no one can help me. So I have to guess at his dates. Well, suffice to say, he graduated in 1921 in classical philology and the next year in philosophy. And given his ambition, I believe he would have been at a pretty minimum age at that graduation, so about the age of 20. So I'm positing that his birth was in about 1900. So he's in his early to mid-20s in 1924. He'd been a student of Enrico Cocchia, who was, of course, a great supporter all the time. He was professor of Latin at Naples, and of Antonio Soliano, who was professor of Pompeian antiquities. And they tended to stand by him. In fact, when he took refuge on Capri at the family villa, he was, in fact, catching the traghetto, or whatever it's called, the ferry, backwards and forwards to consult with Cocchia. Cocchia knew what was going on all the time in August and September. But vital information not previously investigated is provided by his bibliography. And if you just look at Année philologique, there he is again and again between 1921 and 1931. And there's a pattern. He has his own journal called Museon, and he publishes again and again 2 or 3 articles a year in his own journal, articles usually of 4 or 5 or 6 pages, and they cover everything. But his fans take these things very seriously, and the largest article he ever published was actually on a kind of history of education in Naples, from classical times up until more modern times, in volume 2 of Museon in 1924, the very year of the Livy Delusion, 20 pages. And people refer to this later as a kind of standard work on the history of education in Naples, a 20-page article. He had his supporters who boomed up his work. And it goes on. He last publishes, 4 articles in Museum 1926, volume 4, 4 articles. And then the last we hear from him, so that's 2 years after the scandal broke, and we last hear of him in 1931, when he in fact edited a collection of papers by Enrico Cocchia, his teacher, Varietà Letteraria in Naples. He edited it, 1931. And then, total silence. And for a man of his ambition, I have only one answer to that. One of the historian's favourite weapons, Occam's razor. In other words, what is the simplest explanation we can offer for someone totally disappearing? He's dead. It's very early. He's in his early 30s, but since I can't find any evidence whatsoever of his continued existence, and presumably if he'd lived, he would have continued to pour out the articles year by year as he had done up until 1926, but he disappears completely. The only monograph he ever published totaled some 12 pages. It was a book on the agrarian laws of the Gracchi. And so we have these totally different views of him. Some people, an unidentified Neapolitan source, described him as rather well known in the university world, a patient student who delights in learned research. And during the recent centenary celebrations of our university, he aroused lively polemics with a little work. This is the article I spoke about in 1924, 20 pages. A little work in which he maintained the foundation of the university itself, went back to the time of Ruggiero the Norman. A mystery man, you can't find anything about him in any Italian reference work, but he's a very important figure in the state archives. Olgera, his surname is, can't even find his first name. Described Martino as an expert in history and paleography, a most serious person in his life. Of course, Olgera knows him well. He's a Neapolitan. Worthy of every esteem, endowed with a conspicuous fortune. So, as we've already half hinted at, he came from a very rich family. For myself, I suppose that he's been able to find the codex. What the hell was Olgera talking about? In some church or monastery or congregation. Naples is very rich in all of these. Places he visits continually, since he belongs to the upper class, which sympathizes with the Catholic party. So much from Olgera. Reinach, Solomon Reinach, who never met him, remember, told the Académie des Inscriptions des Lettres that Martino was a very honorably known archivist, that he published a history of the University of Naples, that's the 20-page article, and was preparing a history of Italian calligraphic schools, a 5-page article he published in 1923. He was described variously by Rebezzo, for example, as renowned among Latin scholars, a man of considerable wealth, or by Olgera as an eminent scholar of unchallengeable authority, by Delia, another leading figure in the archival world, the glory of Naples, he called him. Sad misjudgment. Pascal, even, the Italian professor in Pavia, a most distinguished student. Conway, who never met him, high-minded, eager and conscientious, a man of the highest integrity. But Sacchi, the journalist, said, to the contrary, a man with minimal sense of reality and of a shadowy nature. He did try to interview him, obviously. Croce, who certainly was furious about the whole thing because he was asked, obviously, by many people, what effect will this scandal have on the standing of Neapolitan intellectuals? And Croce was furious and was going on and on about how it had no influence whatsoever on the way in which Neapolitan intellectuals were viewed. It was an outlier. Vain, mentally feeble, said Croce, a boaster, a person of no authority or fame. But the background. What really gave all the oxygen to this whole story? Well, there's Martino-Fusco. The only likeness we have of him, one of the Italian papers published an interview with him early on, and I'm always suspicious of people who wear bow ties. And just my own amusement, I constructed this map showing the places where, over the centuries, people had suggested the lost books might be found. And you can see it goes from the island of Iona in the Great Northwest down to, in the south, Fez in Morocco, across to the monastery of St. Macarius in Egypt, from Spain and Germany across to Constantinople. This whole story wouldn't have been possible unless that obsession with people who love Livy, as I do, had not been in people's minds since the 15th century. Are the lost books lurking somewhere? Can they still be found? And my only comment on that map is to say to you that, in fact, the only further books that have been found since Petrarch had most of what we have. Petrarch had the first decade, 1 to 10, and the third decade and the fourth decade, 21 to 40. Since then, of course, we've found 40 to 45 and other bits and pieces, fragments and whatnot. They have all been found in Germany. So if you want to find more Livy, I think the only place I would ever look would be Germany. And this is simply the most recent, of course, of the occasions where people have thought we might have found something. 1924, exactly 100 years ago. And had I been talking not so long ago, I would have said, look, this is a fantasy, we have to give it up. We're lost, there's nothing to be found. Except that you must all have seen the advances made in unrolling, or not necessarily even unrolling them, but reading the calcined codices found in Herculaneum. They now can be read even with attempting to unroll them. They come apparently from the library of Caesar's father-in-law, Calpurnius Piso, and all the evidence points to the fact that his library was primarily philosophical. So if you ask me honestly, do I expect a roll of Livy to appear there? My answer is no. But I mean, we can't rule it out now the way we might have done a few years ago before that advance in science was made. And so the whole story, and Sacchi in particular, added another very, very important element to it. It's a complex story, an unedifying story, wasting so many people's time, doing so little honor to so many, especially living. An illustration of this endless yearning for the lost books. And as Sacchi pointed out, it educated the whole world. People who'd never heard of Livy. Every newspaper in the world carried news of this Livy saga. I even find it mentioned in my own country in journals such as The Farmer and Settler, published in New South Wales, or the Newcastle Morning Herald and Miners' Advocate, and a paper in a mining town, Kalgoorlie, the Western Argus. Even they were being educated about Livy. So the story was not entirely without its benefits. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ron. That was absolutely fascinating. That was amazing. I enjoyed that so much. And how amazing. I think today of all days to be thinking about a context in which the potential discovery of lost works by Livy provokes a media frenzy and a kind of worldwide sort of is salutary to think about that. This was also an object lesson in academic actions that we should avoid at all costs, not least pronouncing on things about which we know very little, which I feel is a great danger in my own life. Anyway, so that was just wonderful. I enjoyed that so much. Thank you so much. So we have a roving microphone so we can have a bit of discussion. Please use a microphone so those at home can hear you. Who'd like to kick off? Robert.
That was absolutely fascinating, but you didn't say, perhaps because it's impossible to know, when did they actually reveal that it was a complete falso?
When Nicolini set up, was given the job of chairing the investigative.
When he interviewed him and he broke down?
Yes, and said, oh, but I found this note about King Robert.
Nothing more than that?
No, nothing more than that.
And did that make any ripple in the newspapers as well, the actual denouement?
Yes, it did. There were certain people, whom I didn't bother to mention tonight, in Naples in particular, who'd pinned their faith to the whole story, who were furious and said, no, there's some mistake about this. Because the official investigation ended with a kind of open end about, we should keep our ears open or something, or pay attention. Don't think it's the end of the story. And they seized upon that and were sure that, in fact, there's more to be done, and that Martino could not have been making it all up.
Did you ever find out who this mysterious German was who interviewed him?
No, he's unfindable. You're clever enough to look up Max Bunker. No, there's no sign of him. I mean, where would you look if he's a famous academic? You'd look in Annie Logique. There's no
Well,
sign.
that's 4 lines from Sulpicius Severus.
Yes, yes, yes. And Conway thinks they're typically living in them. If you just look at the first 5 words and stop there. Apart from the edge.
Yes.
Thank you so much for a fascinating, and also I have to say sort of amusing sort of like lecture. It's such a rich history, right? I mean, the history of forgeries, you know, sort of like I was transported to you, Trevor Roper, and the Hitler diaries, and it's just sort of like the way in which, in some sense, like this is a forgery. Like this is the easiest forgery because you don't even have to forge anything. You know, you just have to claim that it exists. And in that sense, it's a really, really sort of fascinating sort of like exception to the rule. So my question really is do you agree with Gramsci's interpretation, or rather how I understand Gramsci's interpretation is namely that basically an academic rival forced Martino's hands. Martino thought that he might have something, sort of boasted about it probably privately, and then without thinking through the implications, and then is basically this rival forced him to reveal this manuscript, except that the manuscript did not exist, and that therefore there isn't even an active forgery happening, or even like that the actual villain isn't actually Di Martino, the actual villain is the person who outed him. Is that sort of
the
like
Sorpezzo.
yeah?
Yes.
Okay. No, I just sort of like I wanted to make that
No,
clear.
that's
That was
clear.
yeah. Thank
I
you.
mean, could you imagine yourself dealing with someone who says, I've made a wonderful discovery? What would you say? Well, you know, tell everyone about it. And he says, no, I'm not ready. Obviously, he said, no, I'm still doing, as he says in his interview, asking for peace and calm and so on. I'm still working on it. And you take it upon yourself to announce the discovery or whatever? I mean, it's outrageous. They were rivals. Some people misunderstood them as friends. They ran each of them a journal. Clearly, they were rivals for academic posts.
And this Roberto, his career did not suffer at all from what you said. His career did not suffer at all from this incident. Like
no, most people just sailed on, pretending they'd never shown their head above the parapet.
Fascinating. Thank you.
It
so
is
much.
fascinating how you get away with things. Yes.
This modus operandi of publishing your own work in your own journal.
A bit
That's
fast. A bit
something,
fast.
yeah, that's something that's
Yes. It's
of the era.
of the era.
Other questions, comments? Yes, we need to get a thank you.
Thank you so much. That was really fascinating and hilarious. I had a friend who was an academic fantasist and made stuff up a lot. So he's no longer with us, sadly, but I've got a bit of personal experience of this. So what I'm interested in, really, this is my question, is really about the academic culture of Naples in the 20s. These presumably men with independent wealth who founded journals, which they then, I mean, this is all a complete blank slate to me. Could you say a bit more about what life at around the University of Naples would have been like in that period with this kind of thing going on?
Yes. You get a pretty full picture, don't you?
I mean, well, can you flesh it out a bit?
Let me see if I can find Croce's telegram.
Oh, yeah, yes, because he was fantastically wealthy as well, wasn't he?
He was.
And very damning of things that he deemed to be of no worth. So
yes,
right, yes.
He was away on holidays at the time, so he sent a telegram, and this is what it said. Where was it published? Oh, it's you can find it in his own collected works, Pagina Sparse, 1960, volume 2. Announcers of fantastic, mysterious discoveries who speak out of vanity or mental weakness are not new to frequenters of archives and libraries in all parts of the world. The lying boast of De Martino, which has not been taken seriously for over a year by anyone who had the faintest inkling of it in Naples, where I don't think that's true, where De Martino didn't enjoy any authority or fame, I already quoted that bit, was unfortunately communicated to the press of the world by means of an imprudent notice published by Professor Rebezzo in his journal. This was the origin of the clamour which instantly followed, favoured by the summer season and the absence of scholars from the city. How about that? You like it? You like it. A ministerial inquiry established the non-existence of the codices, and in a sworn declaration, de Martino, put under pressure, confessed his boasting hypotheses. Notwithstanding these, gossip and suspicions about the substance of the claimed discovery continued in the papers. And to cut short this annoying sequel, an expert Italian literary figure, that's Nicolini, I didn't want to go into this because it's a totally separate story, created the joke of the letter attributed to the priestly paleographer, thus giving a happy ending to the deplorable story. In other words, it was Nicolini who wrote a work called La Farsa Liviana, in which he set up a whole thing in Naples of people who are supposed to know about the lost books of Livy again, and they went through it all over again. I don't indulge in judgments. I state only the facts, such as they are up until now. Italian scholarship, now here's the crux. Italian scholarship is not only entirely innocent of what happened, but it's entirely irrelevant in the matter. Most importantly, what are to blame are the too impetuous enthusiasm of journalists, chronicismo, and as I said, the summer season.
Thank you. Yeah.
Always has the last word, Gretchen.
So then the upshot is when everyone goes on holiday,
That's the
anything
time
can happen.
to pass.
Yes, the Hitler diaries have come up also in the comments online. That is although there we're talking about a deliberate hoax.
That's right.
And you made the point that you used the term delusion because you can see how easy it would be to stray into, oh, I think I found.
Yes, you can understand
Yeah.
why he was misled.
Over a drink, things tend to get bigger.
Yes, and if you're desperate for fame, and you're heading for a chair and so on, only in your 20s, I mean, you'll do anything.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah. Yes, yeah.
Yes, sorry for coming back for more, but it's just a quick factual question. Sort of like you surmise basically because his journal folded and sort of he disappeared, and he must have passed away in 1931. But there were never any obituaries of him in any journals. It's really that's really striking, isn't it?
The whole story disappears, just as it disappears from the biography of everyone who was there at the time, grandstanding and so on.
But it's interesting that he keeps on publishing for a few more years, and then he too just disappears, and nobody
I mean, I
bothers to remember him.
on logic. This man who's desperate to publish every year, even 4 articles in his own journal, total silence. I mean, something dramatic has to happen.
Do other people publish in his journal, or is it just literally? Do other people publish in his journal as well, or is it
Yes,
just,
yes,
okay.
oh yes.
Okay.
Yes, his contribution, I said, are half a dozen pages, plenty of room for other people. We unfortunately don't have it here in the BSR.
Question at the back, Joe?
It's probably in the Biblioteca Nazionale, I would guess.
I was just wondering about the incentives of the foreign scholars who weighed in on the behalf of this invisible manuscript. I mean, what possible motivation could they have for speaking so confidently? It seems completely baffling to me.
Yes, but we are back in the days which I only vaguely remember. By the time I came to be a young academic, the God Professor was going out of fashion. But back in those days, these people who held a chair, I mean, to be a university professor was a very rare thing, though, not like today where everyone has an expectation of reaching professorial rank. But then, there's only one person in a major university who was in charge of the whole discipline, and they were gods on earth. I mean, and people expected them to give answers, authoritative answers to puzzles. And, well, about Conway in particular, I can't, the things you come across by chance. You keep looking. There's always something more fun. Grundy, and I recommend Grundy's autobiography, 50 Years at Oxford, it's called. And that was published in 1925 or 26, so just immediately after this whole thing. And he talked about Conway as a man prone to rash judgment. So someone spotted him.
Interesting, thank you.
I suppose what it reminds me of, we were talking earlier about Berenson, but that sort of connoisseurship tendency. In other words, yeah, I'm the expert, so I
You're
have
the
to
expert.
pronounce.
Yeah.
And this is too important for me not to be pronouncing.
Besides, people expect me to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. A dangerous world.
Yeah.
The sort of like, you know, speaking as an early modernist from the 16th, working on the 16th century, sort of like, you know, a Renaissance humanist would, you know, confidently feel able to pronounce based on that a few lines are authentic, you know, belonging to this Latin or Greek author or not, simply because, you know, because of who they are, and they had, you know, developed the instinct to recognize an author just simply by the je ne sais quoi. And I think it taps into that as well. So I think there's a really deep history here, and sort of like this final, you know, map with which you end is actually, I think, in some sense, really appropriate, because this is a story that comes back again and again and again in different ways. So yeah.
Just comment on the Hitler diaries. Yeah. Any other? Oh, yes, James.
Oh, thank you very much. I'm intrigued by these, you know, sort of rapid fire 5-page short articles of Martino. What does a pattern emerge about where he's sort of staking out, I don't know, his sort of area of academic interest?
I can't quite understand it.
The 5-page article.
Oh.
What is he writing about? I mean, what
Okay,
are they?
okay.
Right.
Okay, I've listed them all because I thought that was the vital evidence we needed to understand him. For example, he writes 3 pages on the Greek envoys to Rome in 156 BC. He writes 5 pages on calligraphic schools in the 6th century AD in southern Italy. That's his reputation as a paleographer and so on. This 20-page article on the schools of Naples from ancient times to modern times. 2 letters of Jacopo Nardi on the translation of the history of Livy. And a Neapolitan temple. This is 9 pages. A Neapolitan temple dedicated to the genius of Augustus, in the Latin sense of genius, which is now the Basilicata of San Gennaro. Some things he doubles up. Actually, he republishes, even in his own journal. Notice of excavations of antiquities in the south of Italy. The classical necropolis of Tarentum, brought to light in March 1926, and the tomb of Archites. He talks about that various times. He's already published. Let's see, when is that? 1926. Oh, he published it again. He's already spoken about that tomb in pages 18 to 27 of 1926, and then he does it again in pages 162 to 166. You see, he'll have a few bites of the cherry. Same so.
What are they like in terms of academic work? Are they?
Sorry, I haven't set eyes on that journal. I don't know. I can only guess that maybe the Biblioteca Nazionale has a copy. Maybe the Vatican has a copy. I've still got to look at that.
Okay.
It's a hard to find journal.
Yeah.
You can find Rebezzo's journal much more easily.
Oh,
Which in itself may be a sign.
Yeah.
I feel that this chat would not be refable. I think this is the important. Yeah. Remember James Mellart? Do you understand
Oh,
that?
Jimmy Mellart. Oh my God.
That's a
Oh,
comment from Edward Fontaine.
oh my God, yes. He's the famous excavator of Chapel-Huyuk, Great Neolithic settlement moment. And he met a young woman on a train somewhere in Turkey who showed him bits and pieces of a gold treasure. And he wasn't allowed to photograph them, but he made some drawings. And then he went to her house with her in Istanbul, and she disappeared, and he could never retrace his steps. And of course, his reputation was totally destroyed. That ruined him. It was thought that he was being used to authenticate these things. You know, the person who owned them, perhaps they released it from some tomb or something. Someone wanted some expert like him to say, yes, they're real, which he apparently did, because he believed in that treasure. There's a book about it. From the name of the treasure of something, all about James and Millard. But he never could even find his way back to the house where she took him. Another sad story, you see.
And
Delusions of grandeur.
yeah, and just a real investment in something being true, which is something we all have to be very wary of in our fields.
Treasure of Antalya, something like that.
Comment from Krzyzewski. Thank you for the talk. While such delusions might be a rare story in classics, in archaeology or Roman topography, the discovery, in inverted commas, of famous lost monuments seems par for the course. And scholars today are just as quick to comment, endorse these identifications based on minimal information. So,
True.
so yes, it's yes, we need to all proceed with care. Yes. So if there are no further comments in the room, thank you for a really interesting discussion. I hope you'll join us for a drink, and thank you so much, Ron. That was really fabulous. Enjoyed it very much.